Hello everyone, I'm your host, Tina Khan, and welcome back to another episode of Voices That Matter with Enlinature. Today, we would be discussing about something that we overlook in our environmental discussions: the deep connection between animal exploitation, economic systems, and environmental injustice. When we talk about climate change, environmental degradation, the first and the last thing that comes to our mind is deforestation, emission. But behind this visible impact lies historical, economic, and structural forces that shape how we use the nature. To talk about today's theme, I'm joined by Max Weiss, who is a social justice advocate from Germany and has a background in chemistry and environmental engineering. Welcome to Nature, Max.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, to unpack our discussion, animal agriculture and fishing are often labeled as food systems, but environmentally speaking, these are extractive industries because they operate at such a level that pushes the ecosystem beyond their natural limits. And it affects land, water, oceans, and even the climate. Now, this brings us to the idea of planetary boundaries. So, my first question to you would be, Max, that how do you think animal agriculture and industrial fishing impacts the planetary boundaries? And how does it accelerate the environmental degradation?
Thank you. So oftentimes in climate and environmental spaces, we have a strong focus on fossil fuels. And this is very important. It's one of the two main pillars of transgressing planetary boundaries. But there's a massive blind spot for the other pillar of transgressing planetary boundaries, and that is agriculture. And within agriculture, there's a stark difference between agriculture for plants, for human consumption, and animal agriculture, so the production of animal products. We see this in the distribution of land. So more than 80% of agricultural land is currently used to produce animal meat, milk, and eggs. And at the same time, it only provides us with 18% of the calories that we need globally, and only 37% of the protein that we need. And this already shows us that there's something wrong. Why do we need to use more than 80% of the land to produce less than 20% of the calories? It doesn't really match, And the problem here is that using animals' bodies to transform energy and nutrients is very, very inefficient process. So I always talk about the concept of trophic levels. Trophic levels show us the position of an organism in the food web. And we have primary producers that are plants, and they store chemical energy from the sun. And then they pass it on to secondary consumers that are ideally us humans, but also around 100 billion farmed animals that are farmed and killed every year. And so always when you pass from a trophic level to another, you lose about 90 to 99% of the energy.
Yes.
And so we are basically artificially populating the planet with highly inefficient bioreactors, so just on a physical level. That's what farmed animals are. I mean, their inefficiency is even greater than that of combustion engines. So they have like about 80% energy loss into heat and heat energy mostly. And the same is true for farmed animals. So a lot of the energy is wasted in the form of in the animal's metabolism, so heat production, building the skeleton, breathing. And you already mentioned the concept, the framework of planetary boundaries. And again, we are always talking about climate change, but it's just 1 out of 9 planetary boundaries. So there are 8 other planetary boundaries. And if you look at them, yes, burning fossil fuels is the #1 cause for breaking the climate change boundary and also the ocean acidification boundary. But animal agriculture, or the food system in general, but especially animal agriculture, is the #1 cause for breaking all of the other planetary boundaries. So of those 9 planetary boundaries, we already have transgressed 7, and some of them to an absolutely catastrophic scale. And that is, for example, biodiversity loss, first of all, foremost. Then we have phosphorus and nitrogen emissions, but also novel entities. For example, that means chemical pollution. And this is something that's very much overlooked. And I think we have to, what we're witnessing now, we have to reframe it, not as climate breakdown, climate catastrophe, but as a mass extinction event. That's what this will be remembered in the future, if there's somebody there to remember this. But this is important for us to understand. It's not just climate change and agriculture. And because of the huge land demand and the inefficiency of animal use, animal agriculture plays such an important role in breaking these other planetary boundaries.
Okay. So what's interesting is that these systems did not develop in isolation. It also depends on how we use the animals, the land, the ocean, and it is also connected with the historical power structure.
Absolutely,
And
yeah.
surprisingly, the areas that are environmentally degraded are also the areas that were at some point in the history colonized. Colonialism system is a type of system that entirely depends on extraction of resources, labor, life from the areas that are colonialized for the global profit. So my next question would be that in what ways that does the colonial history and system influence the modern pattern of animal exploitation and environmental inequality?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting topic, I think, and something that I've only recently started learning about. And like you said, the fact that 99% of today's farmed animals are living in factory farms, it's not a natural development at all. And I want to start out with an example. Maybe some of you have heard about manifest destiny. It was this ideology that drove the colonization of North America, this belief that the European settlers that came over the Atlantic were promised this land by God, and their westward expansion was massively driven by the expansion of the beef cattle complex back then. So it was a massive driver of appropriating more and more land and stealing it from the native population, and also destroying their food system, which is very, very important for colonizers if they want to expel indigenous populations and also break their resistance. So what the colonizers did is they killed off all the bison. And of course, animal agriculture was an easy excuse to do this, because they said, well, we need the land for our cows, you know? And yeah, so animals were a primary tool for stealing land and exterminating the bison to sever indigenous ties to the land and enable the total control of the settlers. And if we look at today at, for example, ecological overshoot of different countries, we see that settler states like Canada, Australia, the US, but also Brazil, for example, they have the highest ecological overshoot. And that is because so much of the land that they use, that they have, is being used for animal agriculture. Of course, fossil fuels also play a major role, but again, if we look at ecological overshoot, it's much more than just carbon emissions. And we can look at this as a form of ecological imperialism. So the colonies became resource peripheries for animal feed, pasture land, to feed the imperial core. And this is something, a concept that I want to talk about later also, is what's called a metabolic rift. So something that a violent severing of natural cycles where nutrients, for example, became pollutants. So now, if you look at the destruction of the Amazon, for example, most of it is because of animal agriculture and also the production of soy for factory farms in Europe, China, all over the world. And so this is a concept that Marx introduced, and it shows the rift in the interaction between humans and nature that ultimately capitalism always creates. And yeah, so this is the modern legacy of these settler states, is this massively industrialized farming system that then was exported into all the other parts of the world as well. So now we're seeing that large corporations like JBS or Cargill are pushing for more factory farming in Africa, where people still rely on a largely plant-based food systems.
Yeah, you have talked about really interesting subjects, and you are pointing out that these crises are not just technical, but they are also political and economic crises. Now, this is where theoretical frameworks like Eco-Marxism are very important because it addresses why exactly are these patterns existing.
Yeah.
Eco-Marxism looks at how capitalism treats the nature and prioritizes profit over ecological limits. So we would move on to that side of the story, and I want to ask you that how does eco-Marxism explains the root cause of today's environmental crisis?
So I believe Marxism is a very, very helpful tool for us because it gives us the tool to diagnose in a scientific way the problems that we are facing. And the key problem that we have is that capitalism cannot exist without appropriating nature and labor. And so this can be human labor, but also what I'm advocating for is that we have to include animal labor in this. Otherwise, we cannot analyze the system that we're facing properly because of the enormous scale that I mentioned earlier, 100 billion farmed land animals every year. And from that comes the growth imperative. So the system is built on a non-negotiable growth imperative. Profit requires constant expansion into new frontiers and turning more and more of nature into commodities. And that requires sacrifice zones. So we see, for example, coming back to the settler states that I mentioned earlier, we still see destruction of primary forests for grazing in Australia, for example. How crazy is that? Or the destruction of the Amazon in Brazil. It's a more well-known problem. So I want to come back to this eco-Marxist idea of this metabolic rift, and it's completely inevitable under capitalism, and it means that nature cycles have to accommodate infinite linear extraction, but it cannot work obviously on a finite planet. And I think also eco-Marxism shows us that it lets us see climate change and the ecological collapse as the ultimate form of class warfare, because all these this extraction and the appropriation of nature, it just serves to accumulate capital at the very, very top. So it's a war waged by capital against the planet and the global south especially, who bear the costs of this metabolic rift, while only the wealthy really profit. Yeah, and my argument is that only if we include animal agriculture in our analysis, we can understand the true scale of this massive land grab and extraction project that has been going on for around 500 years now.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, because at this point of the history, we are standing at a place where I do not think that capitalism and environment well-being can go hand in hand with each other. And these are also the type of problems that are not accidental. They are very structural. Now we will move towards the solution. If we are talking about structural problems, that the solution has to be more than just green technology and protest and policies. So I want to ask you that, do you think sustainable change is possible within the current economic system, or do we have to move toward a deeper structural shift?
So my answer is very clear. It's no. I think most of us already know this, whether it's conscious or subconsciously. We know that the current system cannot provide the solutions that we urgently need. I always like to use the analogy of capitalism to a plane that's in the air, and to stay in the air, it must accelerate continuously to stay in the air. And when this cannot happen, and this cannot go on forever. And the same is true for capitalist societies that cannot produce endless exponential economic growth. And when they fail to do that, then we get the rise of fascism. And there is a dangerous positive feedback loop between fascism and the ecological collapse. So the worse the ecological collapse becomes, the more fascism will be on the rise, because of, for example, people fleeing from their homes because it has become uninhabitable.
Yes.
I mean, you know that too well with the massive floods in Pakistan you've experienced lately, for example. So, yeah, coming back to that analogy, capitalism is like a plane that must accelerate continuously to stay in the air, and on a finite planet that is a guaranteed crash. So endless growth is an impossibility theorem in a bounded system. And we are being sold all these fixes. If you just push a few buttons between the system, if you change this and this, maybe it will work. And it's our role as environmentalists to firmly reject that idea. So green capitalism and tech fixes just change the instruments of appropriation. They might shift the pressure from one planetary boundary to another, but they won't stop the the plane from accelerating and crashing over and over again. So we need a deeper structural shift that addresses the root cause, the growth imperative, and the private control of production. So the control over the means of production, this is a Marxist term, so it means the control over the land, the factories, the servers, and we see that in the media every day. I mean, they are in the hands of a handful of really crazy people, unfortunately, who somehow have all given up on the future of this planet and the future of billions of people and animals, especially in the global south. So the solutions are right there. The means of production must be brought under democratic communal control to prioritize needs and regeneration over profit. And there's studies that very recent studies that show that if we orientate our economic system not towards GDP, so to endless growth, no matter what we produce, but to satisfying human needs. So the needs of all the people on the planet can be met with just 30% of material use. But that requires democratic control of the means of production. Yeah. And so, again, coming back to this metabolic rift, we must adopt post-growth circular principles to heal this metabolic rift. And that can be, for example, indigenous stewardship systems. So thinking ahead many generations, will generations in the future still be able to thrive if we make these kind of changes here and there? Localized food sovereignty, the switch away from animal agriculture towards plant-based systems that can absorb the climate shock waves that are about to come, that are about to hit us really, really hard. I mean, we're gonna hit very likely 2 degrees warming in just 5 years.
Yes.
And then in another 10 years, we will hit 3 degrees warming. And this will obliterate the food system as we know it today. And coming back to this inefficiency of animal farming and this massive land use, this is the best switch that we have at the moment to prepare for these enormous problems that we are facing, to go back from secondary consumers to becoming primary consumers and limiting our impact on Earth systems as much as possible. And yeah, we need a just transition where ecological repair and social equality are the metrics of health, not GDP. But this can only happen if we overcome the current class society that we have, where a tiny group of people just dictates basically all the aspects of our lives, and also all the aspects of our interaction with nature and other animals.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love the example that you use, that capitalism is like a plane that must accelerate in order to stay in the air. But the fuel that this plane is using is our nature, is our ecosystem, is the well-being of the people. And GDP is not the metrics of health.
The fuel is the bodies and of humans and animals themselves, because the system creates so much death and destruction. and it's completely irrational. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree with that. So to conclude, today's discussion reminds us that environmental degradation, animal exploitation, and social inequality are deeply interconnected with each other. And addressing one without the other is risking only talking about the symptoms and not the cause. Thank you so much for joining us today, Max, and thank you so much for giving us your time and your valuable insight.
That's a brilliant summary. Thank you so much for inviting me and having me. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for watching. And this conversation does not end here. It begins with how we rethink about our relationship with the nature, with the animals, with the environment, and with each other. I'll be back with another episode of Voices That Matter. Until then, stay connected with your planet.